Please God, I can't lose her too. The words tore out of Elena Rivera before she could stop them. 3:22 in the morning. The numbers on her bedside clock glowed like a countdown to something she could not escape. Her studio apartment in Chicago's South Side was so cold she could see her breath, thin clouds of desperation floating in the darkness. The heat hadn't worked properly in 4 months. She kept it at 58 degrees because that was all her budget allowed, and even that felt like stealing from a future she couldn't afford. Elena stood in the kitchen that was really just a corner of her bedroom, trembling in threadbare pajamas held together by safety pins at the shoulder. Her fingers were numb. Not from cold alone, but from the letter she held. The letter that tasted like death. Final notice, it said. Red ink, stamped over and over, as if once was not enough to communicate her failure. $47,000 owed. 14 days remaining. 14 days until they took everything. In the next room, her daughter made a sound. Not quite a cry, not quite a whimper. Something between the two that Elena had come to recognize as the sound of Ava's heart struggling. 5 years old and her heart was already giving up. The doctors had said this word, congenital. Had said this other word, terminal. Had said this number, 47,000, for surgery or else. Elena moved to the doorway between her room and Ava's. The little girl lay under 3 blankets Elena had stitched together from donations, her breathing shallow and uneven, her small chest rising and falling like a bird with a broken wing. Ava's skin had taken on a grey-blue quality that no 5-year-old should ever have. Her lips held that same color. When she slept, she looked like she was already halfway gone. The apartment was silent except for that breathing. Except for the sound of Elena's own heartbeat, pounding against her ribs like something trying to escape a cage. $5. That was what sat in her wallet on the kitchen counter. $5 to last until Thursday, when she could pick up delivery shifts again. Even then, Thursday would bring maybe $70 if she was lucky, if the weather held, if her ancient Honda Civic didn't break down, if people bothered to tip. She had not eaten today. She had not eaten yesterday either. The phone on the kitchen counter lit up. Unknown number. She did not pick it up. It rang 5 times, then stopped. 30 seconds later, it rang again. A different unknown number. Then another. And another. Anthony. Her ex-boyfriend Anthony Marchetti had learned that she'd changed her number 4 times. So now he called from numbers he borrowed from his friends, his business associates, his men in suits who probably didn't even know why they were calling. Just did it because he asked. Because Anthony Marchetti was the kind of man who, when he asked for something, got it. Elena had filed a restraining order 8 months ago. It hung on the wall in a frame made of cardboard, as if framing something made it real. As if a piece of paper could stop a man like Anthony. The phone went quiet. Elena set the letter down on the counter and pressed her palms against the cold granite. The granite was fake granite, installed by a landlord who had since disappeared after she'd threatened legal action over the mold. At least he'd had the sense to fear her, though he was a man 3 times her size. Fear was a funny thing. It did not care about physical strength. It only cared about the possibility of being exposed. She didn't notice the car outside. A black Mercedes had been idling across the street for 20 minutes. Its engine was off now, but the man inside had not moved. Giovanni Rossi sat in the driver's seat with his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had gone white. The car was cold, but he didn't turn on the heat. Cold felt appropriate. Cold felt like what he deserved. He had followed her here 3 hours ago, watched her stumble out of the restaurant where she worked double shifts as a delivery driver, still wearing her uniform, still carrying the smell of other people's meals in her hair. The Mercedes was a ghost, she never saw it. Giovanni had learned how to follow people without being followed, had learned it in the streets of Chicago when he was still young enough to believe violence was justice. That was 25 years ago. He had not slept in 36 hours. Before that, he could not remember the last time he had actually slept, not just lain in darkness waiting for something to break inside him. It was the wallet. 3 days ago, at Carmine's Diner on Halsted Street, she had walked past his table just as he was standing up. His wallet had fallen out of his jacket pocket. Such a small thing. A piece of leather and the documents of a life that meant almost nothing anymore. Most men would not have noticed. Most men would not care who returned it. But she had. She had picked it up and opened it, and in that moment Giovanni had seen her hands. Thin hands, calloused from work that paid too little, bearing the marks of a life spent serving other people's needs. She had looked at the ID inside, had seen his name, had gone pale in a way that suggested she knew who he was. And instead of running, she had found him 3 days later at the restaurant and handed him his wallet with trembling hands. No one had ever done that before. "You left this," she had said. Her voice was barely a whisper, like something made of glass that might shatter if she spoke too loud. "I thought. I wanted to make sure it found its way home." Giovanni had not been able to speak. He had simply taken the wallet and watched her flee back to her car, had watched her drive away with the exhaust trailing behind her like a ghost refusing to leave. And then he had done something he had not done in 15 years. He had investigated her. Not with violence. Not with interrogation. Just information. He had made one phone call to Carlo, his most trusted lieutenant, and said one sentence: "Find out everything about the woman who works nights at Carmine's. The one who brought back my wallet." It had taken Carlo 2 hours. Her name was Elena Rivera. She was 28 years old but looked 40. She lived in a studio apartment on the south side, paid rent to a man named Dmitry Volkov who had recently learned not to give her trouble. She had a daughter, 5 years old, named Ava. The daughter had a condition of the heart that required surgery. The surgery cost $47,000. Elena had $400 in her savings account and no way to earn the $47,000 before the surgery deadline 2 weeks away. That was when Giovanni had gotten in his car and driven to her neighborhood. That was when he had parked across the street and watched the light in her window at 3 in the morning. That was when something inside him, something he thought had fossilized 15 years ago, had begun to move again. He watched her shadow pace back and forth in the apartment. Back and forth. Back and forth. Like a caged animal with no way out. Giovanni's phone was on the passenger seat. He could make one call. One call and the surgery would be paid for by tomorrow. One call and her problems would dissolve like morning fog. He had that power. He had always had that power. But he did not pick up the phone. Instead, he sat in the cold darkness of his car, in a black Mercedes that cost more than she would earn in 5 years, and he wept. The tears came silently, running down his scarred face, and he did not wipe them away. The scar ran from his left eye to his cheekbone, a permanent reminder of the night his father had died, the night 15 years ago when a rival had shown him that even the strongest men could be broken. Giovanni Rossi had rebuilt his empire from nothing. He had made himself into something that could not be destroyed. His men feared him. His enemies disappeared. His word was law in a city that had forgotten what law meant. And it had all been hollow. Every empire, every victory over every enemy, had been hollow as a grave. He watched the light in Elena's window go dark. She had gone back to bed, back to that thin mattress, back to the pretense that tomorrow would be any different from today. Back to praying to a God who did not listen to women without money. Giovanni started the Mercedes. He would not follow her again. He would not watch her anymore. Instead, he would do something he had not done since he was 22 years old and believed in things like mercy. He would help. But she could never know it was him. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Now, let us go back. 3 days earlier, to the moment that changed everything. To the corner diner where a dropped wallet and a kind gesture would begin to unravel the carefully constructed fortress around one broken man's heart. The rain had been falling hard that morning. 3 days earlier, the rain had stopped, and the winter night settled over Chicago like a held breath. The stars hung sharp as diamonds above the south side, frost coating the fire escapes and parking meters in a glaze of ice that caught the streetlights and threw them back into the darkness. Elena Rivera sat in the corner booth of Ross's diner at 11:47 in the evening, her fingers wrapped around a white ceramic mug that held the cheapest coffee they sold. $1.50. She had counted the coins twice before ordering it. The diner smelled like decades of grease, like lives that had passed through and left nothing but the memory of themselves in the upholstery. Red vinyl booths lined the windows. Neon beer signs hummed in the glass cases behind the counter. A cook moved in the kitchen with the mechanical precision of someone who had made the same movements 10,000 times and would make them 10,000 more before his shift ended. Elena was 32 years old, but the overhead lights made her look closer to 40. Her delivery driver's uniform hung on her frame like a flag on a windless day. Her hands, wrapped around the mug, were mapped with small scars from burns and cuts, souvenirs from years of working kitchens, and now this, driving food across the city in a car that barely ran. She had $18.73 at home. Ava needed new shoes. The holes in her current pair meant her feet were wet constantly, and Elena could not afford the pneumonia that the doctor said could be dangerous for a child with Ava's condition. But new shoes cost $50. The cost of shoes had become the kind of number that lived in Elena's chest like a second heartbeat, constant and crushing. The bell above the diner door chimed. A man entered, bringing the cold with him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built like something that could survive collision. His suit was black wool, tailored so precisely that it moved like it was part of his skin, and the white shirt beneath was unbuttoned at the neck, showing the hollow of his throat, the first line of his chest. He was perhaps 55, maybe older, with dark hair silvered at the temples and a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to his cheekbone like a knife stroke written on his face. When he moved through the diner, the ambient noise changed. Conversation dropped. People who had been looking at their food suddenly found their plates very interesting. The cook did not emerge from the kitchen. Giovanni Rossi sat in the booth directly across the aisle from Elena, though she did not know his name yet. He ordered espresso in Italian. His voice was deep and solid like an oath carved into stone. He drank the espresso without sugar, staring out the window at the frozen street, his fingers drumming once, twice, 3 times on the table. A gold wedding band caught the light. It was still on his left hand, though the woman who had put it there was long dead. Elena looked away quickly when she realized she was watching him. She finished her coffee and stood, gathering her jacket, her delivery bag, the pieces of her life that she carried everywhere. As she passed his booth, her hip brushed the edge of the table. An accident. Meaningless. But in that small collision, something fell. His wallet hit the floor with a soft slap and slid under her foot. She looked down at it. Black leather, worn but immaculate, the kind of wallet that cost more than a week of her wages. No one else moved. The diner had gone utterly silent. The cook had not returned from the kitchen. Elena bent and picked it up. Her fingers were still cold from the delivery run, and the leather felt like ice. She opened it without thinking, instinct more than intention, the way you might check a child's pockets for dangerous objects. $3,000 in hundreds, stacked like the pages of a small book. A black American Express card with a name embossed in silver, Giovanni Rossi. And beneath that, a photograph. A young woman, dark hair, laughing, her hand placed on her own pregnant belly. The photograph was faded at the edges, creased from being held thousands of times. A date stamp in the corner, August 2008. The woman was radiant. The woman was alive. Elena looked up. Giovanni Rossi was watching her? His eyes were storm grey, and they were completely devoid of expression, the kind of eyes that belonged to someone who had stopped expecting mercy from the world a long time ago. He stood. He was 6'2", at least, and the room seemed to shrink around him. "I'm sorry," Elena said quickly, pressing the wallet into his hand. It fell. "I was just—" "You could have kept it," he said. His voice remained even, conversational, but there was something beneath it, something like the rumble before an earthquake. "Most people would have." The photograph, Elena said, and her own voice was barely a whisper, a candle in the wind. The money doesn't matter. The photograph matters. He took the wallet. His fingers, when they brushed hers, were warm. He was very still, the kind of still that precedes violence or prayer, and she could not tell which. "You lost someone," he said. It was not a question. "My mother," Elena said. 3 years ago. I have exactly one photograph of her, and sometimes I dream that I've lost it." He looked at the wallet in his hand, then back at her. In that moment, she saw something crack behind his eyes, just the tiniest fracture in the stone. Then it closed again. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena." "Elena Rivera." He nodded once. He did not introduce himself. He simply returned the wallet to his coat pocket and walked out of the diner, the bell chiming behind him, the sound hanging in the air long after the door had closed. The cook emerged from the kitchen. The ambient noise of the diner slowly returned. But Elena stood frozen for another full minute, the cold from the wallet still radiating into her hands. 3 days passed. Elena had not told anyone about the man with the scar. She had not mentioned the wallet or the photograph or the way his eyes had looked at her, as if he were seeing not her present but her future, or perhaps her past, or perhaps something that existed in neither time but only in the space where grief lived. She worked her shifts. She picked Ava up from school. She made dinner from the leftover bread that the bakery on 5th Avenue let her take for free. She counted money and recounted it, hoping the total would somehow increase through sheer force of will. But on the 3rd day, after finishing a delivery in a neighborhood she did not usually frequent, Elena made a decision that she knew was dangerous even as she made it. She went back to the places the man had touched, the places he might touch again. The diner. 3 coffee shops on the south side. A restaurant called Valentino's where a man at the counter had given her a look that could kill when she showed his photograph. "You don't want to know him, girl," the man had said. "That man owns half of this city. You show his picture around like that, you're going to get yourself hurt." But on the 3rd evening, standing in front of an office building on State Street, Elena saw a man emerge from the glass doors. Not Giovanni Rossi. Someone else. Someone younger, with a kind of face that belonged to someone who had done things that could not be forgiven. He was tall, muscular, dressed in black, and his eyes passed over her for just a moment before they widened in recognition. Or not recognition. Attention. He walked toward her. Up close, she could see a tattoo on his neck, something dark and elaborate. He smelled like cologne and smoke. "Little girl," he said. "I've been looking for you." Elena's heart stopped. He pulled out a phone and showed her a photograph. It was the image she had shown to 5 different people over 3 days. Giovanni Rossi, the man with the scar, his face captured in a candid moment on a street corner. "Mr. Rossi," the man said, and his voice carried an accent, "something Eastern European, something dangerous, would like his property returned. He sent me to collect it." Elena opened her mouth. She closed it. She had the wallet at home, in a drawer, beneath her winter clothes. She had not opened it again, had not looked at the photograph again, though she had thought about it every moment of the past 3 days. "I'll take you to him," the man said. It was not an invitation. "My name is Carlo. Get in the car." The car was black. It was enormous. The interior smelled like new leather and money. Carlo drove through the frozen streets of Chicago without speaking, his hands on the wheel completely steady, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Elena sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white. She was thinking about Ava. She was thinking about the $47,000 surgery that Ava needed in 14 days, the surgery that the hospital had made crystal clear would not happen without payment. She was thinking about the photograph of a pregnant woman, laughing, believing that her future was going to be something beautiful. The car climbed higher. They had left the south side now and were moving into the part of the city where the wealthy lived, where the buildings touched the sky and the streets were empty and clean. The Mercedes pulled into an underground parking garage. Carlo drove to the top level, to a private elevator, and they rose without stopping. 42 floors. The penthouse doors opened to a wall of windows. Giovanni Rossi stood at the glass, his back to them, looking out at the frozen lake and the city beyond it, a map of light spreading to the horizon like a prayer that had been written in electricity and neon. He was still wearing the dark suit. The scar caught the light from the city below and turned silver. "You could have kept the cash," he said without turning around. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. $3,000. Most would have kept it. The photograph mattered more, Elena said. He turned then. His eyes found hers across the space of the penthouse, across the chasm between what he was and what she was, and she saw it again, that moment when something fractured inside him. He looked at her for a very long time. The city hummed below them, indifferent to the weight of that moment, to the way time seemed to pause and fold inward. "Your name," he said. "I remember it." "Elena." "Yes," she whispered. "You lost someone too." "I could hear it in your voice." Carlo had withdrawn into the shadows near the elevator, disappearing into himself the way men in his position learn to do, making himself less present, less witness. Only the sound of the city remained, the distant wail of a siren somewhere in the frozen night. Giovanni Rossi stepped toward her, and Elena found that she did not step back. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the wallet. He placed it in her hands. "Thank you," he said, "for returning what belongs to me. Not everyone would have." Elena closed her fingers around the leather, and she understood, without words, that something had changed in that moment. Something had shifted in the architecture of both their lives. She did not yet know what it would cost. She did not yet know that a man like Giovanni Rossi did not return favors with gratitude. He returned them with action. With consequence. With the kind of systematic attention that could rebuild a life or burn it to the ground. What Elena did not know was that 3 hours later, Giovanni Rossi would make 17 phone calls. What she did not know was that by morning, someone would have made an anonymous deposit to the account of the hospital where her daughter's surgery was scheduled. What she did not know was that this man, who had spent 15 years building an empire out of cruelty and control, was about to make his first decision born entirely of grace. The penthouse of Giovanni Rossi stretched across the 42nd floor of a Michigan Avenue tower, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Chicago spread below like a conquered kingdom. Inside, documents covered the mahogany desk in meticulous rows. Carlo stood rigid, his dark suit absorbing the lamplight, his voice steady as a hammer striking stone. "Elena Rivera, age 29, widow 18 months, Carlo said, reading from the file. Husband Marco died from cancer. Medical debt from his treatment, $63,000. She's been paying it back on a delivery driver's wage." Giovanni Rossi listened without moving. He was 44, with the kind of stillness that made men nervous. His charcoal suit cost more than Elena's car. Silver threads ran through his dark hair like fault lines, remnants of 15 years spent building an empire from violence and control. A thin scar ran from his left eye to his cheekbone, pale against skin tanned from a winter trip to Naples. His hands rested flat on the desk, each movement calculated, deliberate. "The daughter," Giovanni said, his voice deep and solid like an oath. "Ava? 5 years old. Congenital heart defect. She needs valve replacement surgery." Carlo paused, measuring his next words carefully. "The cost is $47,000. Surgery is scheduled for 14 days from now. Without payment, they won't proceed." The silence that followed was absolute. The city hummed below them, indifferent. Giovanni's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "How much does Elena have?" Giovanni asked. "As of this morning, $5 in her bank account. She's working triple shifts. 60-hour weeks for $340. She's behind on rent by 2 months. The landlord is—" Carlo stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Boss, there's something else." Gino stepped forward, younger than Carlo, his face carrying the kind of controlled anger that comes from witnessing injustice. A woman named Victoria Ashford has been systematically destroying her. Wealthy woman, Gold Coast family, worth maybe $800 million. She's been buying up Elena's debt, paying creditors to accelerate collection timelines. She's blocked payment plans at the hospital. She's had the landlord deny maintenance requests to tank the building's value. Why? Giovanni's voice remained flat, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something cold and dangerous stirred in his chest. Elena inherited a building in West Loop. Small. 2 stories, 20 units. The property is worth approximately $2 million if developed properly. Victoria wants it. She's been positioning it for auction, waiting for Elena to default on everything. When she does, the property goes to creditors. Victoria buys it for pennies. Giovanni stood abruptly, his chair sliding backward with a soft whisper. He moved to the window, his silhouette framed against the frozen cityscape below. December had arrived in Chicago with teeth. The streets were ribbons of salt and shadow. He thought of the photograph in his wallet, the one Elena had returned to him. His wife, dead 8 years, smiling in front of a Christmas tree. He thought of being 16 years old, hiding in warehouse rafters, listening to his father bleed out on concrete, too terrified to move, too young to save him. That shame had built everything he owned. Handle the surgery, Giovanni said quietly. Anonymously. I want it paid tomorrow morning. And I want protection on her building. 24 hours, rotating shifts. She doesn't see them, she doesn't know they're there, but nothing happens to her without my men witnessing it. Carlo's eyebrows rose almost invisibly. Boss, we don't typically. I'm aware of what we typically do. Giovanni turned from the window, and his lieutenant saw something in his face they had not seen in 15 years. A crack. My father died because I was too afraid to help him. I will not watch another innocent person die because I lack the courage to act. The penthouse fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic below, car horns mixing with the white noise of the city at night. At that same hour, in a Gold Coast penthouse 12 miles north, Victoria Ashford sat in a silk robe the color of champagne, her phone pressed to her ear. She was 56 years old but looked 40, the kind of woman who spent $50,000 annually on maintenance. Her penthouse was minimalist, all white marble and glass, nothing soft, nothing warm. A photograph of her late husband hung above the fireplace, and she had not looked at it in 6 years. Tell me she's still broke, Victoria said to the investigator on the phone. Her voice was thin as a blade. Very broke. But something changed. Last night she was seen at a restaurant on Michigan Avenue. She was with a man. Tall, dark hair, expensive suit. Italian accent when he spoke to the waiter. Victoria's hand tightened on the phone. Name? We're working on it. But his men were everywhere. Black SUVs, earpieces. Professional security. Find out who he is. Now. Victoria disconnected the call without another word. She moved to her desk and pulled up the hospital system, accessing files through a contact who owed her a favor. When she found the surgery authorization for Eva Rivera, she scrolled through payment status and went very still. A new entry. Posted this morning. $47,000. Paid in full. Anonymous. Victoria's reflection in the window showed a woman whose face had hardened to stone. She picked up her phone and made 3 calls in rapid succession. First to her lawyer. Then to the property appraiser. Then to a man named Anthony Marchetti. I have a job for you, she said when he answered. There's a woman named Elena Rivera. She's getting protection from someone, and I need to know who. I need you to visit her, escalate things, make noise. Let's see if the man protecting her comes out of the shadows. What do I get? Anthony's voice was ragged, eager. $20,000. And the satisfaction of being with her again, briefly. She heard him breathing heavily on the other end. I'll do it tonight. Across the city, in a South Chicago apartment, Anthony Marchetti stared at his phone. He was 32 but looked older, his face carved by rage and alcohol. The walls of his studio apartment were covered with photographs of Elena. Some from 3 years ago, when they dated. Some taken recently, zoomed through a telephoto lens. Her at work. Her at the grocery store. Her entering Ava's school. He opened a safe beneath the floorboards and removed a handgun, black and heavy. He pressed the magazine into place with a click that echoed in the small room. He had called Elena 17 times in the past 2 months. The restraining order was a piece of paper. Officer Brennan, his contact on the Chicago police force, had assured him that the restraining order meant nothing as long as Marchetti kept payments coming. $40 a week, Brennan had texted him. Keeps me looking the other way. When you visit, I'll make sure no one responds too quickly. Anthony had prepared a speech for when he visited Elena. About how she belonged to him. About how she couldn't hide from him. About how every man she tried to move toward would be corrected. But now, with the news from Victoria, something deeper had awakened. Something that made his hands shake and his vision go red. Another man. Someone with money. Someone with security. He loaded the second magazine and headed for the door. The night was cold enough to crack teeth. Meanwhile, in Elena's apartment in a converted brownstone, Elena Rivera sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the debt collector's letter in her hands. The envelope was stamped final notice in red letters that looked like blood. She had $5 in her account. Rent was due tomorrow. $850. Ava's school clothes were wearing through at the heels. The radiator clanked and hissed but provided almost no heat. Elena wore 2 sweaters over a thermal shirt. Outside the window, December pressed against the glass like a living thing. Ava slept in the next room, her small form lost in blankets, her breathing shallow and slightly labored from the heart defect that was slowly stealing her life. The surgery was 14 days away, and Elena had no way to pay for it. She had prayed. She had cried. She had stopped crying because tears were a luxury her body could no longer afford. That morning, the hospital had called with news. The surgery was approved. Payment received in full. Anonymous donor. Elena had asked Mrs. Chen, the billing administrator, 3 times if it was real. If it could be a mistake. Mrs. Chen had smiled with something like tenderness and said, "No mistake, Ms. Rivera. Someone wanted your daughter to live." Elena didn't know who. She didn't understand why. But standing in the freezing stairwell of her building that afternoon, she had felt something shift in her chest, like a lock turning in a door she thought was sealed forever. Someone saw her. Someone had intervened. She didn't know that on the street below, 2 men in dark coats watched her windows. She didn't know that they would be there all night, rotating shifts, watching for danger. She didn't know that her building's broken locks were being repaired by Giovanni's contractors, that her car was being serviced by Giovanni's mechanics, that her survival had become a matter of personal responsibility for a man she had met once, briefly, 3 days ago. She also didn't know that 3 blocks away, Anthony Marchetti was loading ammunition into his car, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. She didn't know that Victoria Ashford was making phone calls to debt collection agencies, accelerating timelines, intensifying pressure. She didn't know that the trap was closing from 3 directions at once, and that what came next would require a kind of courage she didn't yet know she possessed. Outside, the November wind tore through the empty streets like a blade wrapped in ice. The apartment door exploded inward at 10:24 p.m. on December 22nd, wood splintering like bones breaking. Anthony Marchetti filled the doorway, breath coming in ragged clouds of white vapor, the cold seeping in behind him from the frozen Chicago street below. His gun hung at his side, but his hands trembled with something more dangerous than rage. Obsession. Madness. The madness of a man watching his prey slip through his fingers. Elena heard the crash from the bedroom. She was reading Ava a picture book, the one with the blue whale, the one her daughter had asked her to read 7 times that day. The words caught in her throat. That sound. She knew that sound. She had heard it in her nightmares for 2 years. She moved on instinct, not thought. She scooped Ava from the bed, the 5-year-old small body tensing immediately, already understanding in the way children do. Already knowing danger. Elena's hand shook as she locked the bedroom door, a flimsy lock that would not hold for more than seconds. "Mama." Ava's voice was barely audible, that small trembling sound of a child calling into darkness. "Sure, baby. It's okay. Mommy has you." But she did not have him. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to break free. She pulled Ava into the corner, the farthest corner from the door, and sank to the floor, her back pressed against the cold wall. December cold. The radiator in this building had never worked properly. Everything in her life had never worked properly. Anthony's voice came through the door, slurred and venomous. "I know you're in here, Elena. I know you're with him. With Rossi. You think a gangster will protect you from me? You think some suit with money will stop what's coming?" Each word hit like a fist. She had heard these words before, variations of them, whispered through the walls of previous apartments, screamed through car windows, left in voicemails that made her stomach turn to stone. "I own you," Anthony continued, his footsteps moving through her apartment, overturning furniture. The sound of her lamp crashing to the floor. The television falling. Everything she owned, however meager, being destroyed in his wake. "You understand that? I own you. You are mine. You will always be mine." Elena pressed her forehead against Ava's hair and counted her daughter's heartbeats instead of her own. 120. 130. Too fast. All of this was too fast. The bedroom door shook as Anthony's shoulder hit it. Once. Twice. The lock rattled in its mechanism, a sound like a bell tolling in a cemetery. "Come out, Elena. Come out and take what you deserve." He hit the door again. The wood groaned. She could see the crack forming in the frame, thin and spreading like lightning. Then he fired. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the small apartment. The bullet punched through the lock, tearing a hole in the door. He fired again. The second shot came through lower, wood fragments exploding inward. Ava screamed, a sound so small and terrified that something in Elena's chest broke entirely. "It's okay, baby. Close your eyes. Don't look. Don't look at anything. Just hold on to Mommy." But Elena's eyes were open. Her eyes were wide open because she needed to see him when he came through that door. She needed to know how much time she had. She needed to know if this was the end. The door was buckling. One more kick and it would come free. Anthony's hand reached through the hole where the lock had been, fumbling for the handle from the inside. She could hear his breathing now, hear the madness in it, smell the whiskey and rage. Then the apartment door exploded again. But this explosion was different. This was not Anthony. This was thunder. This was the sound of something heavy and unstoppable moving through her home. Gunshots. Multiple. The distinct crack of weapons being fired with precision, not rage. Footsteps, heavy and coordinated. Men moving through her apartment like water finding channels. Anthony screamed. Not words, just a sound of shock and pain and the realization that he was no longer the predator. The bedroom door remained closed. Elena held Ava against her chest and did not move. She did not breathe. She did not do anything but exist in the darkness with her daughter's small body against hers, waiting to see what horror would come through that broken door next. A knock. Gentle. Almost courteous. Carlo's voice came from the other side, steady and calm as a man ordering coffee. "Ms. Rivera, you are safe now. It is over. You can open the door." She did not open it immediately. She counted to 10. Then 20. Then she reached up with shaking hands and turned the lock, and the door swung inward. Anthony Marchetti lay on her living room floor, his face pressed against the carpet, both hands zip-tied behind his back. Blood ran from a wound in his shoulder where one of the bullets had found him. He was breathing. He was alive. He was trembling like a caged animal, realizing the cage door had been opened by a hunter, not a keeper. 4 men in black suits stood around him, their faces blank, their posture the casual violence of men who did this regularly. Behind them, standing in her doorway with the winter wind moving his hair, stood Giovanni Rossi. He was not the gentleman from the diner. He was not the man who had quietly paid for Ava's surgery with a single phone call. This was someone else entirely. This was the man whose name made other men's voices go quiet. This was the predator who had been watching from the shadows all along. His eyes found Elena in the corner, found Ava pressed against her mother's chest, and something shifted in his face. Something cold and ancient and furious. He looked at Anthony Marchetti the way a general surveys a battlefield already lost. "You made a mistake," Giovanni said, his voice like ice forming on water. "You hurt something I protect." That was all he said. Then he turned to Carlo and spoke in Italian, words Elena did not understand but could feel in her bones. A sentence. A judgment. An execution of a different kind. Anthony Marchetti was dragged from Elena's apartment 15 minutes later, screaming, his shoulder bleeding, his face a mask of shock and terror. The men in black suits moved with the efficiency of a machine, leaving no trace except for the broken door and the understanding that they had been here. Giovanni waited until they were gone. Then he stepped into Elena's apartment and closed what was left of the door behind him. She stood slowly, Ava still clinging to her like a monkey, the girl's small face buried in her mother's neck. "You are safe now," Giovanni said. His voice had returned to something almost human. Will he come back?" Elena's voice was breaking like thin ice. "No," Giovanni said. "He will not come back." And in the way he said it, with such absolute certainty, she understood that Anthony Marchetti was about to disappear from her life in a way that had nothing to do with mercy or forgiveness. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the darkness of her apartment with Ava curled against her, watching the city lights through her window, waiting for the next disaster. But no disaster came. Only silence. Only the feeling of being protected by something vast and dangerous and, for now, pointed in the direction of her enemies instead of toward her. What changed everything was a phone call that came at 6:51 the next morning, December 23rd. FBI agents in dark coats arriving at a warehouse in South Chicago. Evidence of illegal weapons trafficking. Evidence of financial crimes. Officer Brennan and 2 other cops in handcuffs, their badges stripped away, their careers destroyed. Anthony Marchetti being dragged from a safe house at dawn and loaded into a federal van, his face blooded, his future measured in decades. 40 years minimum. That is what his lawyer told him. 40 years in a cell for weapons trafficking, for conspiracy, for crimes he had committed in partnership with a woman he believed had his back. Victoria Ashford did not learn about Anthony's arrest until she was walking into the WGN Morning News studio, her hair perfectly styled, her outfit worth more than Elena's car. She did not know that her phone had been hacked. She did not know that every email, every text message, every financial transaction had been collected like evidence in a trial she did not know was being conducted. She did not know that Giovanni Rossi's network had been watching her for weeks, assembling the scaffolding of her own destruction. She walked onto the set smiling, and the host smiled back, and for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Victoria Ashford remained a philanthropist, a society woman, a pillar of Chicago's elite. Then the feed cut to something else. Documents flooded the screen. Bank transfers. Emails. Text messages written in her own hand, discussing how to accelerate Elena's financial collapse. Discussing how to deny her daughter's treatment. Discussing the property seizure, the calculated destruction of a woman she had decided was disposable. What is this? Victoria's voice became sharp, a blade. What is happening? The host looked at the producer, confused. The feed continued. More documents. More evidence. Her partnership with Anthony clearly detailed. Her conspiracy. Her crimes laid out like a confession written in her own blood. Within 1 hour, federal investigators arrived at her penthouse with warrants and cameras. Within 3 hours, her face was on every screen in Chicago. Within 6 hours, every person who had ever called her friend had deleted her from their phone. She was arrested at 3:15 p.m. on December 23 in front of 17 photographers and 4 news cameras, her face streaked with tears and mascara, her hands in cuffs, her entire identity collapsing like a building whose foundation had been quietly removed. 20 years. Possibly more. Conspiracy, fraud, racketeering. The charges stacked like bodies in a grave she had dug with her own hands. Giovanni Rossi's justice was not quick. It was not merciful. It was total. It was systematic. It was a scalpel instead of a hammer, cutting away at the fabric of their lives until nothing remained but ash and imprisonment and the understanding that they had lost everything. Elena learned about Victoria's arrest from the news. She was sitting on a bench outside St. Mary's Hospital, waiting for Ava to finish her final preoperative examination. The surgery was tomorrow. 10 hours of careful work from the surgical team, 10 hours of a child's heart being repaired by hands more skilled than fate. She held her phone and watched Victoria Ashford's face disappear from the news cycle, replaced by mugshots and federal charges. She watched Anthony Marchetti's name appear in headlines about organized crime and weapons trafficking. She watched both of them vanish from the world that had been built on crushing her. And she understood, in that moment, that someone had burned their entire world down because they had hurt her daughter. Not because she deserved protection, but because someone had decided that her survival mattered. That her daughter's survival mattered. That an invisible woman, someone the powerful had written off as nobody, actually mattered to someone with the power to change everything. She did not cry. She had cried enough in her life. Instead, she looked up at the hospital's glass doors and watched Ava walk through them, small and brave in her little winter coat, and she thought about how tomorrow, her daughter would receive the surgery that would give her a normal life. How none of this would have been possible without the man who had followed her home in the rain. How trust, terrible and fragile and absolutely necessary, had changed everything. The surgical lamp hummed at 7:51 a.m. Elena sat in the waiting room of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, her hands folded so tightly her fingernails carved crescents into her palms. Ava was already in pre-op, already asleep, already having her chest marked with surgical lines that would soon become the only thing standing between life and death. The waiting room smelled like stale coffee and antiseptic, like 1,000 people's prayers that had soaked into the carpet and never quite dried. Giovanni arrived at 7:31 a.m. with a cardboard tray holding 2 black coffees and a breakfast sandwich Elena could not afford to want. He set it on the plastic chair beside her without speaking. Some people fill silence with noise. Giovanni Rossi, 6'2", built like the consequence of poor decisions, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Elena's apartment, filled silence with presence. His dark eyes, the color of storm clouds the moment before lightning, held something she had not seen in a man before. Not pity. Not obligation. Something closer to recognition, as if he understood that she was standing at the edge of an abyss and simply needed someone to stand there too. Carlo and Gino took positions at the far end of the corridor, their bodies angled to see anyone approaching. They wore their usual black suits, their usual expressions of polite violence. But they did not approach Elena. They had learned, over the months since Giovanni decided she mattered, that their boss preferred to be alone with her. The clock on the waiting room wall clicked forward. 6:30. 7. 7:30. 8. Each minute stretched like taffy pulled at both ends, becoming thinner and more fragile. Elena's voice came out fractured. Why? Why did you pay for her surgery? Why did you protect us? I'm nobody. You don't know me. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing above them, a sound like insects trapped between worlds. Giovanni did not look at her. He stared at his coffee, untouched, cooling in his hands. 15 years ago, he said, his voice deep and solid like an oath, I watched my father bleed to death in a warehouse while I hid in the rafters like a coward. I was 17. The Carmine family sent 3 men to remind my father that loyalty had value only if you paid in cash. I heard him scream. I did nothing. He turned the coffee cup slowly, watching the dark liquid shift. I built an empire on that shame. On revenge. On making sure I was never powerless again. But power didn't fill the hole, Elena. It just made it bigger. He opened his wallet. The leather was soft from years of being held in expensive hands. He pulled out a photograph, edges worn smooth, colors faded to sepia. A woman with dark hair, and Giovanni's eyes looked back at them, pregnant, glowing, her hand resting on her belly. "Maria," he said. "My wife. She died in childbirth in 2008. Our daughter died with her. I held her body for 47 minutes before I could let her go. For 15 years I have been walking through life like a ghost, Elena. Like a man soothing a lost child, except I was doing it for myself. Then you came into that diner at 3 in the morning, covered in rain, and you returned this wallet. You could have taken the cash. $1,700. You had maybe 5 in your pocket. But you said the photograph mattered more than money. Nobody has said anything like that to me since Maria died." Elena's eyes were streaming. She was not crying like a person who had lost control. She was crying like a dam that had finally fractured, grief and fear and gratitude pouring out of her in waves she could not catch or contain. "I still don't understand," she whispered. "You have a daughter who needs you," Giovanni continued, his eyes now on her face. "You work 3 jobs and count every dollar and smile at her anyway. You're everything I couldn't be when my father died. You're brave enough to keep fighting when the world is trying to destroy you. Helping you, helping Ava, it helps me remember that person still exists somewhere inside this broken machine." He put the photograph away with care, as if it were made of glass. "You matter, Elena. You have always mattered. I am sorry it took me so long to prove it." Elena reached for his hand. His palm was warm. His fingers were scarred, worn from years of holding a gun, holding power, holding the weight of men who depended on his decisions to keep them alive. She held it anyway. The doors to the surgical wing opened at 2:11 p.m. Dr. Patel emerged, her surgical mask hanging around her neck, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. But she was smiling. "The surgery was successful," she said. "Ava's heart is repaired. She'll need monitoring, physical therapy, careful activity management as she grows. But she's going to be fine. She'll have a normal life, Elena. A full life." Elena made no sound. She simply collapsed into Giovanni's arms like a building imploding, and he held her the way a man holds something precious, something that matters, something he is terrified of losing. Carlo and Gino watched from the corridor, exchanging a look they had seen change between them over months. In 15 years of working for Giovanni Rossi, they had never seen him sit beside anyone like this. Never seen him choose a person over an empire. Never seen him choose to be human instead of a weapon. They withdrew quietly, understanding that something essential had shifted in the architecture of their boss's soul. 3 months later, in the spring when Chicago bloomed with cautious green, Elena's life had begun to take a different shape. The surgery debt had dissolved into the past, paid by a man who could pay any price without feeling the cost. Her apartment was safe now, no one had threatened her in weeks. She had taken online business courses, started a small catering company from her kitchen that was actually generating profit. Ava was healthy. Ava was running. The color had returned to her cheeks like someone had drawn it there with a crayon. Giovanni kept his distance the way a man keeps a wound clean, respecting the healing, not rushing the process. But he appeared in small ways. A business license mysteriously approved overnight, cutting 3 months from the usual timeline. A catering contract for a major corporate event that launched her reputation across the city. Flowers delivered on Ava's 6th birthday with a card that said only G, in handwriting that looked like it had learned to be gentle for the first time. They saw each other occasionally. A coffee shop where their eyes met across tables and held for 3 seconds too long. A park where Ava played and Giovanni watched from a bench, no longer the Mafia boss, just a man learning what it meant to be present for someone. Elena stood as his equal now, not a victim he had saved but a survivor who had rebuilt herself with her own hands, her own will, her own courage. The distance between them was becoming unbearable in the way that distance becomes unbearable only when you have tasted what it means to be close. 6 months after the surgery, a mountain lodge in Wyoming. Blizzard conditions. The kind of snow that erases the world, that turns everything white and quiet and small. Giovanni had invited Elena and Ava for a weekend. Carlo and Gino remained in the main lodge, giving him space, finally understanding that their boss's protection had evolved into something more vulnerable and more necessary than any empire. Ava slept upstairs, finally healthy enough to run in the snow until she collapsed laughing, finally able to be a child instead of a sick thing that required careful handling. Elena and Giovanni sat by the fireplace, the world reduced to this warm space while the storm raged against the windows, throwing itself at the glass like something trying to get in or get out. The fire crackled. Outside, wind howled like an animal in pain. "I need to tell you something," Giovanni said. His voice was different now, less like an oath, more like a confession. The surgery payment. The rent assistance. The business license that appeared overnight. The catering contract. All of it. That was me. I have been protecting you since the night you returned my wallet, Elena. I should have told you sooner. I know, Elena said quietly. Giovanni turned to look at her. His eyes held genuine surprise. I figured it out months ago, Elena continued. A business license doesn't get approved that fast. Catering contracts don't appear in your inbox from nothing. I kept waiting for you to demand something in return. To ask me to owe you. To make me indebted. She moved closer to him, her body warm from the fire. But you never did. You gave me space to heal. You didn't demand anything. You saved my daughter's life and then stepped back and let me rebuild on my own terms. Do you know how rare that is? Do you understand what that means? She took his face in her hands, her palms against the scar that ran from his eye to his cheekbone, that map of old violence. I spent 2 years running from a man who wanted to own me, Elena said. You spent 6 months proving you just wanted me to be safe. Yes, I'm still here. Yes, I'm choosing you. Not because you saved me. Because you let me save myself. They kissed, slow and careful, 2 people who had survived hell learning what it means to trust again. 1 year later. Elena's catering business had expanded to 3 employees, all of them women who had experienced the kind of poverty that teaches you to understand hunger in your bones. Ava was 7, healthy, fearless, the kind of child who laughed at the world because the world could no longer hurt her. Giovanni had stepped back from the violent parts of his empire, focusing on legitimate businesses, trying to become the man Maria would have wanted him to be. The building Elena had inherited, the one Victoria Ashford had tried to steal at auction, now stood renovated into a community center. Job training. Food assistance. A place where invisible people could become visible to themselves. The grand opening happened on a spring day when Chicago sunshine fell gold across everything it touched. Ava cut the ribbon with her small hands while Elena and Giovanni stood beside her, his arm around Elena's waist, his wedding ring catching the light. Anthony Marchetti was serving 42 years in federal prison. Victoria Ashford had received 25 years, her fortune seized, her name erased from the places where it mattered. Every day we choose between fear and trust, between closing ourselves off and opening our hearts. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let someone see us, scars and all, and believe we deserve to be loved anyway. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Share this with someone who needs to know that second chances exist. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you good health, joyful days, and peace that lasts. We will see you again in the next video.